Alright, this is a short segment to get us to the 1960s. We left off with Sputnik, the satellite that roared. And again, although Sputnik really was not any kind of real threat to the American people, the image that it brought forward definitely was viewed as a threat. And it was really just a tiny satellite that really couldn't do a whole lot, didn't have any real high-tech cameras or anything along those lines. But the fact that the Russians could actually put something into space that would look down directly into an American's backyard was something that caused a great deal of fear. And as you can see here, the U.S. response was that Congress quickly responded by pushing defense spending. So this was something that was waning a little bit. Obviously, after World War II, defense spending went down because it is the United States and it is our way of war. However, in truth, what we see is that this is the point where defense spending goes back up, not quite to wartime levels, but it does go up, and it will continue to stay a large percentage of the budget from this point forward. So this is a pretty important point when it comes to the American way of war and the things we've talked about up to this point, where it seemed almost inevitable that after any war the Americans would immediately disarm. And there was some disarmament after World War II. In fact, as we talked about, the forces that were sent to Korea were really just a shell of any kind of real force. But the fact that the Russians had both nuclear power and were showing that they could actually put missiles into space and satellites into space that potentially, either at some point or at that point, could deliver nuclear weapons to the United States was something that caused the U.S. to crank up its defense budget. So the Cold War, in a sense, is the reason that the United States does not go back to its true or interwar viewpoint of cutting the military dramatically. So Sputnik, although it by itself was not the thing that caused that, it was a very important signpost along the way of what America was worried about and the reason that we spent a lot more money on the military than ever before. The other thing it did was pass laws and throw federal support behind math and science education. I will mention that the military and other things were reorganized after World War II. For instance, the Air Force was broken away as a piece of the Army, which it had been all during World War II, and it becomes its own independent service because it has shown how important that it truly is. The Pentagon is not only built during the war, but it's actually symbolic of the fact that the U.S. will change its structure for the military with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and that's something that is still in place today. And then finally, Sputnik causes many laws to be passed, some federally, which is interesting, dealing with federal support behind both math and science education. There's a sense that NASA was created directly out of this. It took a little bit of time, but you could make a very strong case that NASA's creation was connected to the impact that Sputnik had on the American population. All right, so I think we talked about this in class a little bit, but just bringing up the issue of the 1950s themselves, and there's a kind of a, well, it's not just a myth, it's a stereotype of the 1950s, that what was really going on is what you see here in these images. There was a TV show called Father Knows Best, and you can see here the dad goes to work, he comes home, the mom stays home and takes care of the kids are all happy, and everything seems to be in its place. I know the little picture and poster I have on the wall in the room of the Good Wife's Guide that came out of a 1950s textbook was really related to this same image, that's the way things were supposed to be. Those families you see in the middle are the Cleavers from Leave It to Beaver, which is another show that had the same basic family structure. And then the conventional view of what women were supposed to be doing after World War II is the one you see there on the right, Another Day in Paradise, cooking dinner, and so forth. So that was the image, but as we've talked about before, that was far from what really occurred during the 1950s. I want to go back to the Happy Days idea and the notion that everything was very calm, and everybody had very mundane issues that they had to deal with, just the stuff of, especially for teenagers, of growing up, parents working, the mom being at home, and so forth. But again, at the same time, you have this juxtaposition of the fact that there's this huge fear of the Soviet Union and how it might actually attack the United States and turn it into a glow-in-the-dark parking lot. The reality is that this is more like what we're talking about here. The 40s and 50s were the incubator for the 1960s. You can see the beginnings of all of the movements of the 60s if you really go back and look at the 1950s. The Civil Rights Movement, of course, which is the first one that really appears and becomes prominent in the minds of most American people. The Women's Liberation Movement, in a sense, giving Rosie the tool so that she could be Rosie the Riveter, and then telling her to go back into the kitchen and cook things really didn't work out that well. And you can see women elected to Congress in 1954, a great number beyond anything that had ever been there before. We do have a beer commercial here that again shows the chauvinistic attitude in general. And then finally, this book on the right, which if we had time we would read, is a very interesting take on all of this, as Stephanie Kuntz actually takes the nostalgia trap that people have of the 1950s and really knocks it apart and shows that everything that's a movement in the 60s was actually underway to some extent in the 1950s at the very latest. And finally, our last influence here on this particular PowerPoint is the beginning of rock and roll, which is it's the beginning of the whole thing that you'll see in the 60s, which is a repeat of the 1920s in many ways, only the big difference is that you have the baby boom generation. So rock and roll will become the jazz of the 1960s. Psychedelic drugs will become the alcohol of the 1960s compared to the 20s. And you see a few versions here. There's Little Richard on the left. Of course, that's Elvis in the middle. You see the jukebox, which brings music that people can actually choose to play into dance venues and other places, and you can see people actually just dancing out on the streets, and that's probably New York City, although it could have been Philadelphia, where they occasionally filmed a TV show that will become popular in the 60s called American Bandstand. All right, now we're taking a look at the 1960s, and the headline here, or the title, actually fits it very well: Why Protest in the Great Society? Now, by Great Society, we mean that in the 1960s, prosperity and relative security return, a period of cultural behavior very much like the 1920s seems to occur. The big difference is, of course, new technologies, including television, which brings information with almost immediate impact on the American people, and that cannot be discounted, just as the internet will become that same basic idea after 2000. But the other thing that was a big difference was the millions of college students in the 1960s, opposed to the only thousands of them in the 1920s. And so this revolt of youth was amplified by the outrage over the Vietnam War that we'll see. And there was a sense by the younger generation, the baby boomers, that their parents, by beginning and doggedly pursuing the Vietnam War, and since they were the older generation and the governing structure of the nation, had destroyed their claim to moral authority, or so it seemed to thousands of young people. So the short version of this, and I'll give you a couple more details in a second, but the short version of this is that the youth of America who grew up during the 50s, and they were born, many of them, the baby boomers who are part of all the protests in the 60s, were very young during World War II, or were just born right after it, of course. The baby boomers themselves, a group of people that historians actually look at as being born from 1946 to 1964. And it was called the baby boom because it was a large number of children that were born within that time frame. And the reason there were so many born in comparison to, say, the previous generation was had a couple of things behind it. Number one was the fact that during World War II, most of the men were overseas, and the women in general were working at home. And then when the two got back together, obviously there was a large number of people who got married and had children very quickly. The other thing was that now in prosperity, people would not only just have one child, but many. And that you compare that to what was going on during the Depression, which was the entire 1930s. And so there was just a much larger number of people who were born at that point. And as I've said in class before, this group of people, which in psychological terms is called a cohort, meaning a group of people about the same age, as they travel through history, will just be this large number of people, and no matter where or what time frame they're in, what time of age, or whether they're teenagers or in their 20s or in their 30s or 40s or wherever they are, whatever age they hit, there's so many of them that they strain the system and strain the previous norms for people of that age group. So, and the other thing is that because they are so large and they have such a big impact, they often leave quite a bit of waste or trash in their wake, and we'll get to some of that as well. But it's almost like this big clog that goes through a pipe, the pipe timeline, and every time it gets to a new phase, it stresses the pipe and everything that's around it. And then after they move through, then there are dramatic changes and all kinds of issues. So their view was, when they were getting out of high school and into college, a very different one than their parents had been. They had not really been chastised by World War II nor by the Depression. Instead, they had really grown up in a time when the United States had pretty much everything you would want. And they're so important that the economy and many businesses begin to cater just to their age group. It's not just a coincidence that when they are children and moving into early teenage years, the toy companies will explode in growth. And then when they're teenagers, anything to do with the teen lifestyle becomes very important and makes a ton of money, and so forth. So as they move through life, and where they are now is actually at retirement, which means they're going to put a huge strain, and they already have begun to, on the Social Security system and on our dealing with the elderly. But this group of people, when they were late teenage and in their early 20s, was in college, which some people have called extended adolescent. Their parents had gone to work right away, but they were in college at a time when they were considered to be adults and yet didn't have the responsibility yet of adults. And so they were a little bit more idealistic than their parents had been. That's probably an understatement. And so when they did get of age where they thought they could begin to make a difference, they began to push for all kinds of things that were really probably not reasonable. The idea of a culture that was perfect and had all these new changes and everything else. And ultimately what happens is, when they run into the real world responsibilities that they will have, they rebel. And that's really what we get in the 1960s. It's just they get angry because their idealistic view is really not supported like they think it should be, and so they rebel against their parents. Ironically, that they are now the parents and grandparents of kids your age now. So the other thing is, why protest in the Great Society? Because this was probably one of the most successful times in American history. When you think of all the protests that go on in the 60s, you really think that that there would have been some sort of massive problem going on, maybe like the Depression. But instead, it was protest at a time when things were very good. And this added to the parents' view that there was something weird happening here, because everything was good. Why are they so angry about everything? And again, most historians look at it and believe it has something to do with that loss of idealism, or at least having idealism held back from them. One example of the change is the election of 1960. TV comes of age. Now, it's a very famous election. It's John F. Kennedy, only the second Catholic ever nominated, against Richard Nixon. Nixon, the Republican, and of course Kennedy, the Democrat. Nixon had dutifully been Eisenhower's vice president for 2 terms. Ike had never really liked him. He had sent him to do his dirty work on many occasions, going to different things to represent him and other things along those lines. He'd been a very dedicated and supportive vice president. I mean, he had done everything he was supposed to do, and in a sense it seemed like now it was his turn when Eisenhower decided to step down. But of course he had to, because in 1951 Congress had sent to the states, and the states had ratified the 22nd Amendment, which required that no president could serve more than 2 more terms. So this election is a very interesting one, and one of the things that's really important about it is that when Kennedy is elected. He is the first president born in the 20th century, and so we'll talk more about that in a second. We have to come up with another small little segment before we hit the larger one.